Hello listeners, thank you for your feedback. The decision has been made. From January, this podcast will be known as Authors Afterword. Same content, just a different name. I've been told there shouldn't be any changes in regards to the RSS feed and your subscriptions, but knowing what I do about technology, if by the middle of January an episode hasn't shown up in your feed, you may need to search for Authors Afterword in your podcast app and resubscribe. Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 106, bringing on an author and talking with them about one, occasionally more, of their books in detail. And if you find yourself enjoying today's episode, do share it with your friends. I'm Charlie Place, and today I am joined by Nikki Marmery to discuss her second novel, Lilith. In Nikki's book, Lilith was created alongside Adam to live as equals in the Garden of Eden, but Lilith eats the fruit of the tree of knowledge and thereby understands all that the god Yahweh did not want the couple to know. Yahweh banishes Lilith from Eden, which actually turns out to be not such a bad thing, because it means she becomes immortal and therefore has time to try and reverse the tide of man now being superior to woman. Once out of Eden, she finds that she and Adam were not the only humans on Earth as they were told, and she looks to help Adam's replacement wife, the subservient Eve, from a fate the goddess Asherah, Yahweh's wife, did not plan. Hello, Nikki.
Hello, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me. And by the way, that is a brilliant, very succinct intro to the book. I wrote the thing and I don't introduce it as succinctly as that. So thank you for that.
It took me a couple of drafts, but I think I was focusing on what most wowed me with my own religious background. And we're going to be talking about a couple of those things, basically. I would like to start with a question I know you've had before. The inspiration, the way Asherah was taken out of tradition.
So in my book, Asherah is the wife of God, Yahweh, in the Old Testament. And that comes from the historical reality. Asherah was worshipped alongside Yahweh in early Israelite religion. She was erased really out of the mainstream part of the religion over the course of the first millennium BC. But we have lots of archaeological evidence that shows us how important she was, especially to ordinary men and women, sort of rather than you have the texts which tell us what the authorities in the religion want people to believe. And then you have real life, everyday religion. And we have lots of evidence that Asherah was very central, especially to women, in what became Israel in the first millennium BC.
You say about the evidence. Did I read rightly? There are like thousands of different icons of her that we've got.
Yes, I mean, thousands of these terracotta sort of figurines of her. And they're usually sort of interpreted as sort of fertility figurines, which is true, you know, like all mother goddesses, that's sort of her big thing, the fertility. But that also kind of downplays her significance. There's a statue of her in a museum in Israel that is still labelled Asherah, the sacred prostitute. And that again is another thing that often happened to female divine figures in religion. They get viewed through a modern lens, a lens that says if they are sort of overly sexualized, that means they're profane rather than divine. But of course, in the ancient world, that's not the way it was. You know, there is literally nothing more important than bringing life into the world. And especially for ancient people, your ability to regenerate, to have new generations, depends on your fertility. It's literally the most important thing there is. And so, you know, that sort of downgrading of status, and it happens not just in the Israelite religion, in all the religions of that region, that downgrading of the female divine figure, a mother goddess, fertility goddess, into a sort of a more profane sort of idea. That's something that you see in every part of that region, from Greece, Anatolia, Syria, all around Iraq, Iran.
Well, I want to stick on the subject because your book is what's introduced me to Asherah and this whole concept, and it has blown my mind completely. Yeah, I think it's going to actually be a catalyst for changing what I think about religion, frankly, your book.
That's amazing to hear. That's absolutely amazing to hear. Yeah.
Well, I want to ask, in all the research that you've done, Do you think there was ever a chance that Asherah might have been able to survive history for longer, or maybe other female gods?
That's a fantastic question. And I think the answer is absolutely. The impetus for sort of erasing Asherah from mainstream religion really came from the top down. And it was a reaction to these disasters that befell the Israelite people in the first millennium BC. First of all, the Assyrian invasion, then the Babylonian invasion and exile. And the response to those disasters was, Yahweh's angry with us because we're worshipping other gods. And chief among those other gods was Asherah, his consort. And so that was very much a sort of a top-down effort to sort of say, no, that's in the past. The idea of Yahweh as a monotheistic God, a sole God, when we're looking back, we think that's the way it always has been in the early Hebrew religion, but that is not the case. Israelite religion, like all religions of that region, started off as polytheistic, and that move towards a monotheistic God, a sole male God, was a process, and it was very much a top-down process. In fact, there are these wonderful passages in the Bible where you see people's resistance to her sort of erasure. See these passages where the prophet Jeremiah has been bemoaning the fact that people won't give up their worship of the Queen. She's called the Queen of Heaven at that point in the Bible. And you see the popular people saying, no, we won't stop worshipping her. We will carry on. And he's berating the fact that the women are making cakes for the Queen of Heaven. There's a wonderful passage where he's saying the fathers are kindling the fires and the women are making cakes for the Queen of Heaven. And they don't want to let go. These are the women of Jerusalem in about the 6th century BC. They don't want to let that go. And I think that makes complete sense. For me personally, the idea of a sole male God just seems absurd. Apart from the fact that life comes from women, the idea that all divinity is manifest in a sexed male being is just absurd to me. But when you think about the context of the ancient world, it becomes even more absurd, because for women, the most important thing in your life, you have no contraception, no access to medicine, no access to birth control. The most important thing in your life is your fertility and ability to have children. Huge risk and dangers that are involved in having children. Every time you're pregnant, you're staring death in the face. The chances of your babies dying, the chances of your children dying is very, very, very high. And that is why women needed female goddesses in the ancient world, because they're the ones that women prayed to ensure safe pregnancy, safe delivery of their children. And you can kind of see when that sort of switches to this idea of a sole male God, when you look through the Bible, there is nowhere in the whole Bible where the sole male God is remotely concerned about women dying in pregnancy or the risks of childbirth or the risks of babies dying. He's just not interested. And that's what female goddesses did. They were interested. They cared. That's who women prayed to. They were very, very, very important to them. And, so I think looking at it that way, what purpose did gods serve in the ancient world? And you can see why, ancient goddesses were really important to real women. And I think that's a real loss, that I think in the modern day, I think women still feel the loss of that. Certainly that loss of status, which goes along with losing the idea of female divinity. But I think that's something that we're still grappling with today.
Yeah, no, as you're saying, I'm thinking that a female goddess, be she Asherah or, well, you quote Artemis in your book, in Anna, whoever she is, obviously she takes away fear. Whereas traditionally, well, you put the fear of God in you, there's a reason that is a phrase. So I suppose, having a goddess there would have taken away that fear. And obviously fear is very useful sometimes to some people, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It's a way. You can use fear to control people, and it's no coincidence that the beginning of Genesis, which is the inspiration for this book, it's no coincidence that this male god punishes the first woman for this sin of seeking wisdom by punishing her to give birth in agony. That sort of link is not really a coincidence. You have a male god punishing the first woman, and by extension all women, for the sin of curiosity or seeking wisdom, which, by the way, there is absolutely nothing wrong with. In fact, it's most people think seeking knowledge is a good thing. For that sin, she is punished to give birth in agony and be subject to the authority of her husband. Now, who does that benefit in the real world? Obviously, that is a story that has been created because it proves immeasurably beneficial to men. That's the whole point of it, really.
Yeah. And listeners, I am actually going to, this has occurred to me, it'd be a good idea to link you to these passages that Nikki is talking about in Jeremiah and that, because, I mean, as you're reading it, whether you know the Bible a lot or not, you kind of get the sense that Nikki's giving you the real deal, and she absolutely is. You read these passages, and if you read them in this different light, it's very interesting with all the pillars and the poles and things about the goddess. So I will include them for you. We have to bring in Lilith, I think. Can you tell us when she came into the book, into your mind, I suppose, and all about her in the context of your book?
Lilith is a very, very ancient archetype in myth. In fact, she's probably the oldest female archetype there is. She started life in Iraq nearly 5,000 years ago, and she starts life as this demonic figure, and she's particularly threatening to pregnant women and babies. There's a brilliant book called Woman's Law by Sarah Clegg, which I highly recommend, which sort of explains the sort of meaning and significance of Lilith through time. And her point is that it's very likely that again, demonic figure emerged as a way for women to control their fears of pregnancy and childbirth, because this Lilith would drag fetuses from her mother's womb. She preyed on babies and children. In the real world, that's a way to sort of control your very real fears about things that you have no control over, pregnancy and childbirth, as we've said, being incredibly dangerous. So that's how she starts life. And almost more than that, it's not until 1000 AD that she becomes linked with the Garden of Eden and becomes, in Jewish mythology, the first woman. And so really, at that point, what's happening is you've already got this existing demonic figure who is very dangerous to pregnant women, small children, and she's also, at that point, acquired this reputation for appearing to men in their dreams and seducing them in their dreams as a sort of a succubus figure. And so this idea of her as being the first woman gets tagged onto that sort of very long history of all these dangerous qualities that she has. And this story emerges that she was created equal to Adam originally, but when she asserted her authority, she was thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and that's when God creates Eve, who is very clearly a subservient figure. She is made from Adam's rib to denote her subservience. Adam is then given full control of her. So it's a story that explains how woman came to be inferior. And so that's really what attracts me about that story, because that's a myth, obviously, but it does reflect something that did happen in the ancient world, in the Bronze Age and prehistory, and that is that demotion in status of women. For thousands of years, women have been not worshipped, but female divinity is responsible for bringing life into the world. For thousands of years, any mind that conceived of a god conceived of a female mother goddess, because that's what seemed obvious to people, because women give birth. And when women have status along with that in ancient religion, they are certainly equal, and in some scenarios are in control of religious worship and things like that. And then along comes this idea that not only are there no female mother goddesses anymore, but there's one god, and he's male, and he's decided that all women are inferior. And, that's a sort of a mythological reworking of something that did happen. And that is that demotion of women as patriarchy arose across the Middle East in the Bronze Age and became the dominant social model. And that's really what I wanted to explore. I wanted to sort of use this myth of Lilith to explore two things, really: that loss of women's equality that happened in prehistory, and the loss of the concept of a mother goddess, which is absolutely linked. The two things go hand in hand. You can argue about what comes first, but for me, it's probably a sort of a spiral, a circular thing where one informs the other, and it just sort of gets worse and worse and worse for women until they literally become property belonging to men. And that's the rise of patriarchy. So that's really what I wanted to explore. And I wanted to show how relevant it is. This isn't a thing that happened several thousand years ago. I wanted to show how relevant it is to the way we live today, because it is so fundamental. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you see how that idea that man is superior and woman is inferior, once you see how that was reinforced through very powerful religious authorities for thousands of years, and when you see how recently it is that we're coming out of that, but everything we have, everything in our culture, everything in our institutions was built by people who absolutely thought that male authority was ordained by God. And so it is all around us. And that's what I wanted to show. And that's why I wanted to bring Lilith up to the modern day. I wanted to show the consequences of that mythical moment in Genesis where God announces that woman is inferior, which really also refers to a real thing that happened in the real world.
I mean, it sounds like there's trickery all around, really, doesn't it? It's obviously there's a concentration in your work and in the whole idea of Lilith and goddesses in general of women being equal.
Yes.
But the whole thing sounds like a trickery for everybody.
It's a con. It's a huge con. I mean, it's a con obviously for women, but I think it's also a con for men because they have gained for several thousand years, but it's no way to live. It's damaging. It's damaging to think that one sex has authority over the other. It's damaging in the way we think about our relationships to each other. It's also damaging to the way we think about the world, because those two things are very connected as well, because in the ancient world, women were very closely connected with the natural world. The mother goddesses were all very incarnate in the world, as opposed to this new idea of a male god who sits above the world and is above it. He's not involved in it. He's got a sort of a superior spiritual realm. That's a new idea. The old idea is that this world is everything we have and divinity is incarnate within it. And so because women had that association with the natural world, you then have that second thing that happens in Genesis, which is that God gives man power over the natural world as well. He gives Adam two jobs. He's in charge of women and he's in charge of the natural world. It encourages this idea that the world is ours to do with as we will, rather than that we are just one of many species who live here, and it's not ours to control, it's not ours to exploit relentlessly and no concern for what it can sustain. That idea that we have dominion over it, I think, is incredibly damaging, and it's very different to how people thought in the ancient world. In the ancient world, the earth was holy, it was divine, because it was literally the body of the mother goddess. The earth was her body. You know, it provided sustenance for people in the same way that a mother's body provides sustenance for its children. And people cherished and respected the land because of that. So I think that, again, is something that we have really lost and could well be the final thing that finishes us off. That lack of respect for the world, that lack of respect for the other creatures and species that live within it could well be the thing that finishes us off.
Well, also, you said divinity there, and I'm going to ask you about that later, because the whole heaven on earth and not necessarily needing or having a heaven, I'm definitely going to come to that. Listeners, I've also noted that Nikki has said about Sarah Clegg, and you may remember that Jennifer Saint a few episodes ago also mentioned Sarah Clegg, so I think we should all go off and read this women's law already. So yeah, and also, you've answered a question I had in what you said, Nikki, in that I was thinking of how you've used Lilith as more of a conduit of knowledge, and she's travelling through time. I mean, my goodness, she travels through so much time, and kind of looking for a prophet instead of herself being one, which was something that I was wondering about. I actually wondered if she was going to turn out to be the prophet. I also wondered if maybe actually Jesus was going to turn out to be a prophet. I understand why that doesn't work now, but that was in my head as well as a possibility. Yeah, I would also like to ask more about your use. You have added in ancient Greek, as I said, Artemis, ancient Greek mythology. You've added in Mesopotamian history, I think it is, Sumerian. I'm going to stop there because I'm going to start getting it wrong and add ones that you haven't. I want to kind of, ask you about your research and how you've included it into the book in this way, using religion. Yeah, if you could just talk about your use of religion and your various sources.
Well, I wanted to bring in all these various mythologies. And the reason for that is that all of these cultures, we sort of think in silos, really. You think about Mesopotamian mythology, Egyptian mythology, Greek mythology, Hebrew mythology, or biblical mythology. But really, these people all interacted with each other. They all influenced each other. In the Bible, you see, especially in the Old Testament, the large parts of the Bible are reworkings of much older Sumerian and Mesopotamian myth. The flood myth, even the Garden of Eden, all those sort of motifs originally came from much, much earlier Sumerian mythology. And there's also references, there's lots of interactions with Greek mythology as well, which are less obvious, and all the other mythologies of the region. So that's really the reason that I wanted to bring all these things in. I wanted to connect all these things up because they were connected. These people in the ancient world all lived, traded alongside each other, and ideas and myths and beliefs traveled from culture to culture, and they sort of got adapted and changed as they went. And in fact, Lilith is a great example of that. Lilith, who starts life in ancient Sumer, which is ancient Iraq, she then travels to literally every culture of the Levant and the Middle East. She appears in Greek myth as Lamia. She goes absolutely everywhere. Then in the modern day, she's most recognizable in the Jewish mythology as the wife of Adam. So that's why I wanted to sort of link all these things together. I really wanted to join the dots. And also, for me, in my sort of reading of it, mythology is not just a sort of a dead collection of stories that people used to believe in. I think mythology, there's echoes of historical reality that you can read in mythology, which make it much more interesting to me because it means there's aspects of it that's real. And I think it often lives on as well. So there are aspects of these myths that are still very, very relevant in the modern day. And one of the things that happens, for example, with symbols of the ancient mother goddess is that they all get reinvested, and they all really ended up with the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary inherits in sort of Christian iconography and mythology, inherited all of these aspects that were once belonged to these local regional mother goddesses.
Mind blown.
And you see that very much. I'm half Greek Cypriot, so you see that very much in the Greek world, where all of these symbols, the dove, which also then becomes the symbol of the Holy Spirit, that's originally the ancient mother goddess, pomegranates, which were really associated with fertility goddesses, then it becomes linked to the Virgin Mary. That very idea of a mother and child, that's much more ancient than Mary and Jesus. You see it in Isis and Horus. You see it in the ancient world all that time, that sort of duology of a senior mother goddess and her junior infant male child. That's a really very important motif in the ancient world that got sort of reinvented in Christianity. So these things, you see them, they come up to the modern day. I find that absolutely fascinating. I find these sort of things that people used to believe thousands of years ago are still here in one form or another, and I find that absolutely fascinating.
You've actually made me think of Catherine of Aragon, which is obviously something completely different, but I believe that her symbol was the pomegranate.
Yes, and I presume that's probably to sort of link her to the Virgin Mary. In the ancient world, the pomegranate's relevance is regeneration. And so that's why it becomes linked to sort of death and the afterlife, in the Persephone myth. But then in the Christian era, that changes subtly from regeneration to eternal life, which is a different thing. In the Christian era, it becomes associated with eternal life, and that's why you see it in so much Christian iconography. But that's a reinvention of a much, much earlier idea, which is that sort of very female-centric idea of regeneration, of you personally don't live forever, but you will create the next generation, and the next generation will create the next generation. Fruit, the seed, the tree, the circular aspect of life. And that changes to become very linear under Christianity. That idea, you lose that idea of that sort of regeneration, and you move towards this idea of a eternal spiritual afterlife, which is much more linear. So yes, these ideas get sort of reinvented and they acquire slightly different meanings, but their original meaning, is much older and goes much, much, much further back.
I've got so many questions I want to ask the writer/writers of Genesis right now. I want to know the editor. I want to know what happened.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was finalized in its current form around 500 BC. There are much, much, much older bits of the Bible than that. So it's actually sort of one of the later bits to be settled in this final form. And so that's very much a product of its time. 500 BC is not actually that long ago. And of course, that was a very, very, very patriarchal era. And so the writers of that story knew exactly what they were doing. These symbols, the snake, which at this point has had thousands of years of association with female wisdom, the fruit of the tree, which are the ancient symbols of the mother goddess for obvious reasons. These are the things which in this new worldview become evil and wrong and sinful. And there's a reason for that. They need to suppress these earlier beliefs that the people had, which coincidentally gave women power. And in this new system, they have to be suppressed. So it's no coincidence. It's propaganda and it has a purpose.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you on someone who I think will fit in with this, and also this is going to be, I suppose, the start or a touch of the things I want to ask you about the divinity and the heaven and the earth and that kind of thing. Ereskigal, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, I'm not sure. But I want to ask about your use of her, because you've got her as Asherah's sister, which I believe is only from one source, which is really thrilling. You know, obviously you've had to get your story from different things and you put different variations together. And I just want to ask you about using her in the Underworld and yeah.
Yes, so Ereskigal in Sumerian mythology is an important goddess. She's the goddess of the Underworld. And she is the sister of Inanna, who is a very, very important goddess. You know, in my reinvented world, I have her as the sister of Asherah because I've identified Asherah with Inanna. You know, as I sort of mentioned before about ideas and myths crossing cultures and sort of national boundaries, that sort of archetype, Inanna, she has sort of correspondence in all of those later religions of the Levant and the Middle East. So, you know, Asherah has many sort of qualities that link her to Inanna, in the same way that other mother goddesses do as well. So that's a very tenuous link I meant, which I wanted to bring in this idea of the much older Sumerian mythology being the precursor to the biblical mythology. So in my book, when Lilith and Samael are seeking Asherah, they want to know what's happened to her. She's disappeared and they want to know where she is. They go looking for her and they sort of get information that she is in the underworld. And again, that's a very ancient recurring motif in mythology, that descent into the underworld to get something, but which also changes you.
Like Orpheus.
Yes. So that's very, very sort of a recurring ancient idea. You can read it as a sort of a descent into your psyche, that going within, there comes a point in your life when you realize something's missing and you have to go within, you have to go and search for it. And it requires a sort of a cutting off from the real world. It requires a withdrawal and a really deep soul searching to find the thing that you're looking for. So this is what Lilith does. Lilith and Samael go to the underworld to seek Asherah. And in all these myths, something must always be left behind. Something must be lost. To return from the underworld, you have to pay the price, always. Something must be given up. Something must be sacrificed. In the Sumerian myth, which is very, very, very ancient, Inanna goes to the underworld where she confronts her sister, Ereskigal. And Ereskigal does what happens in my book, which is she hangs her from a meat hook. And this is a sort of a symbol of Inanna losing her divinity. She is losing everything that makes her special. She has to disrobe before she goes into the underworld. There are 7 gates, and at each gate she takes off another piece of clothing. She is removing all of these outward aspects of herself so that she can really go deep and soul search. And when Inanna finally comes out of the underworld, she has to provide a replacement, and the replacement that she provides is her husband, Dumuzi, who has to go to the underworld in her place. So that's the sort of inspiration for what happens in my book, which is that Lilith and Samael go to the underworld to search for Asherah, and something or someone must be left in her place when Lilith finds her and removes her.
Well, I loved your character of Samael so much that as much as seeing the donkey die, because the donkey hadn't done anything wrong, I did kind of want it to be left at that, and I was like, oh, he's gone, but obviously I can see why you do it, and he comes back, so that's all right. I'm going to have to ask about him later, because I love that character. Continuing on this then, I suppose, you've drawn a very hard line against the existence of heaven in your book. I would say that's my interpretation. But yes. You've looked at the underworld.
Yes.
I find that fascinating. You've got an underworld, but then you haven't got heaven. But then obviously you're using the underworld in a certain way, and it seems that later it won't be around. Can you talk about your choices here?
Yes. Now, it's very complicated.
Go for it.
And one of the reasons it's very complicated is that the idea of hell was not there at the start of Christianity, which might be surprising to some people. It comes a lot later. In early Christianity, what people were expecting to happen was when Jesus was talking about a kingdom of heaven, what people were expecting to happen was that in their lifetime, which is something that Jesus said to people, he said, this will happen in your lifetime. They were expecting the dead people literally to come back to life on earth, on this earth. That's what they were expecting to happen. And it didn't happen. And so this idea of the afterlife in the version that most Christians would recognize, it comes later, much later. In Hebrew mythology, there is an idea of Sheol, which is what I call it in my book, this idea of an underworld, but it's confused and there are different versions of it depending on which text you're reading. It's not a sort of a clear, very straightforward understanding of what the underworld is. But in some references to it, it is very similar to that ancient Greek world of an underworld where shades or shadows of people go after they die. So that's why it's kind of complicated. I mean, I wanted to write about the idea of an afterlife, but it was complicated by this idea that has changed throughout the time frame of my book. So it was very difficult to do, and I'm not entirely sure I sort of got it right. But what I really wanted to get at is this idea of judgment. I wanted to get at the idea that the concept, I think very few people today sort of believe in hell as a place of judgment, but that's quite recent. You know, for most of the history of Christianity, people have absolutely believed in that. People have absolutely believed in the idea of hell as an eternity of punishment. And that's really what I wanted to get at, because it's such a horrible idea. It's so horrible. This idea that you will be judged and you will either have an eternity in heaven, which actually to me doesn't sound that great either, because I'd sort of an eternity of sort of disembodied spiritual life doesn't really appeal to me. I know it does to some people, but it doesn't appeal to me. And certainly the idea of an eternity of grievous bodily punishment is hideous to me. So that's what I wanted to write about, really. And I think it comes into the reason it's relevant in my book is that I wanted to contrast these two belief systems. You know, in the ancient female-focused belief system, you have this idea of regeneration on the earth. The earth is all there is. It's holy. You have this idea of people being buried and returned to the earth, but they're not expecting to be resurrected. They're not expecting an eternal individual life. It might just be the idea of a sort of a general regeneration, a return to the soil, that sort of thing. This new idea that this world is like a waiting room, a blink of an eye before the real business of eternity, I find really damaging and worrying, because it leads us to not cherish and respect this world we have, which is all we have. And again, that idea of an eternity of sort of consciousness, or however you know, different people, of course, do imagine it in different ways, but it doesn't seem appealing to me at all. And the judgment aspect of it indicates that it's about control, this idea that you will be judged for your actions and that will determine where you spend eternity, indicates that it was a way of controlling people, which is exactly how it worked. You were told what to do, and if you didn't do it, you would have an eternity of hell. And that sort of comes into the equation when you have this idea of a soul male God, because this soul male God is about hierarchy, he's about judgment, he's about authority, he's about setting the rules, and you have to follow them, and you're not allowed to question them, and you're not allowed to seek wisdom, you're not allowed to look for alternatives. This is the way it is, and you must follow it. And that, for me, is a very bad belief system. It's a very hierarchical way of looking at things, and that doesn't seem to me ideal. And I wanted to contrast that with these previous ideas that people had, which in many ways seem much healthier to me and would not have caused the damage to this planet and to so many people that we have seen with these ideas of judgment and control.
Yeah, I know it goes against, you want to believe. I think the answer is always, oh, you just got to believe it. But I've always struggled with the idea that what you do on Earth is going to be effective with what you do after life, you know, with judgment and everything you said. Yeah, it's bonkers, isn't it? Because, yeah, okay, we're meant to just believe. That's the whole Christian thing. You just believe. But we don't know for definite.
It's just so unfair. People are not having the same experiences in this world by any means. And, you know, that idea that you'll be judged for eternity on the way you behaved in a completely different sphere when you had different priorities. It doesn't make sense to me.
You've got looking after our planet, you said it here, and that is big in the novel, and obviously it gets more important the further we get towards our modern day in your book. So I did want you to kind of maybe expand on this, in that how much is this to you an environmental novel?
I was writing this book throughout lockdown, and in fact I don't think I could have written this book if I hadn't been in those very particular circumstances. So I was separated from the world forcibly, like everyone was. And I was thinking about big things. I was thinking about really big things about the way we live and why, and why we were in this situation. And, especially at that time, there was this understanding that the reason that COVID was happening was because of a mistreatment of the natural world, or disrespect for the way that we interact with the natural world. So I was thinking about that a lot. And so it became a big thing in the novel. It wasn't really, I hadn't sort of set out from the start for that to be a big focus, but it really did creep in, sort of all following really from that moment in Genesis where God gives Adam dominion over the natural world. And it connected in lots of ways. And it has led to, where we are now. We're now facing potentially being wiped out as a species because we haven't paid attention to our habitat. We haven't cherished it in the way that we should have. And it, is the biggest crisis that we're facing as a species. And it's all because of this idea that we are in control of it. Eastern philosophy has a completely different sort of prioritization that is much more about sort of balance and harmony. And I think that is one of the reasons we're in this mess.
We all saw it, didn't we, whether on TV or in person, how the natural world just took over quite quickly when we were in lockdown, and how wonderful it was in many ways. Obviously, okay, we're not going to be able to make that happen all the time. We need to go out, we need to do our shopping, we need to use our roads and stuff. But maybe we really need to kind of think back on that and do something to, 10-20% of that, bring it back,
Yes, lockdown was really, it was obviously, I don't want to be flippant, it was an absolutely horrendous time, and, so many people have died who shouldn't have. But it was a very sort of epoch-changing moment where you got to sort of really look at what you're doing, whether it's what you want to be doing, and to look at so many systems and think, does this work? This is crazy. Why are we doing it this way? We don't need to do it this way, which is a good thing. It's good to sort of reassess, how things work every now and again.
I think this is going to link to things you've said before, but I suppose to concentrate on it more. I alluded to it in my intro. You have first changed the creation story to there being more people outside Eden, which is wow. And then you also, I've actually put here, see also Noah Ark's flood happening in only one region. Yeah, can you talk about this specific nature of the Bible stories and how they're actually kind of in a vacuum and everything is just getting on with life around them?
Yeah. These are stories that were told for a long time as oral stories and then were sort of nailed down in their sort of current form, mostly throughout the first millennium. So mostly between about sort of 800 BC and up to about sort of 200 or 300 BC. And of course, they reflect the views of the people who lived at that time and had that world. And so they didn't know about, places that were very far away. Their world was limited to what they knew. So you have this kind of crazy scenario where you have a book that's sort of purportedly sort of talking about a universal explanation for the creation of the world. But of course, it's very, very, very local. And so, from a modern era, well, we know everything we know. You can look back at that and, it's no mystery. We know why it's like that. It's because that's, what people knew at the time. But it does kind of underline the absurdity of it really, the idea that there's a God who creates a whole world, but he's only interested in this very, very, very small part of it. That doesn't make any sense. In particular, all the things that happen are these very sort of localized things that happen in this very sort of small part of the much bigger world. So I wanted to kind of sort of reference that really. So you have the scenario when the flood is happening, that Nerea, who is in my book, the wife of Noah, of course, she's not mentioned in the Bible, but Nerea sort of is the one that says, don't be so stupid, Lilith. Of course, this isn't happening everywhere else. There's other parts of the world. So I just wanted to sort of knowingly reference that because it's one of the things that is kind of absurd about about the Bible purporting to be a universal explanation for life. And that sort of that whole part of the book is very much taken from the biblical texts. So Noah's drunkenness is absolutely referenced in the Bible. When you sort of read the Bible deeply, it is infuriating the way that, you see men who are really not very admirable in any way, not just drunkards, but sort of rapists and murderers, who are still held up as sort of righteous. And then, of course, the women get vilified for nothing, for seeking wisdom, for starters. So that all that business about Noah is very much taken from the biblical texts. And, there's that moment where he curses his grandson, Canaan. And of course, in the Bible, that's the explanation for why the Israelites, you should enslave the Canaanites. And the explanation is that Canaan's father, Ham, saw Noah naked, which is obviously ridiculous and absurd. But there are sort of some commentators on that passage who think that it's been sort of edited to obscure what's really happening, which is that it refers to a sort of a much older myth, which is in line with lots of other myths in the region, where what's happening is that Ham, in the Bible, the terminology that's used is also the terminology that's used for having intercourse with. And so the idea is that it refers to a much older myth in which Ham has either sort of sodomized his father or perhaps removed his genitals, because that's a sort of a thing that happens in myths of that region. The son sort of unmans the father and takes over. So there's all these sort of ideas that perhaps that's what's actually going on in that myth. And I don't sort of go into that myself, but I do reference this crazy story where Noah curses his grandson to slavery because his son saw him naked. It doesn't make any sense. But that is what's in the Bible, which I think is surprising to some people.
Well, what you're saying about the translation and stuff, I mean, the effective original sounds a lot more reasonable, a reason to get all cursy with someone, doesn't it? Yeah.
It certainly does, because otherwise it doesn't make much sense. And there's lots of episodes like that in the Bible where the language has changed sort of over time, many, many times, and the original sort of meaning has been slightly obscured or hidden. And there's an absolutely brilliant book by Francesca Stavrakopoulos, who wrote God and Anatomy. It's just a really fascinating book, but also she's kind of forensic in all of these episodes in which that language has changed and in which it completely obscures the original meaning. She outlines many episodes in the Bible where God's genitals are discussed, which of course is not very obvious when you read a sort of a modern version in English, but it's there in the original Hebrew, which is fascinating because it sort of harks back to that sort of idea of that God originally being just like all other gods in that part of the world, a very physical, bodily God, not this idea of a floating entity, which I think more people would think about today.
Yeah, no Sistine Chapel God, white hair and coming from the clouds, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's quite a modern, relatively sort of new image of God. There are much older images in which, Yahweh is a young, strapping man, which is really surprising to the modern reader.
Fascinating. Okay, so I think, I would actually like to get onto the writing. I haven't read On Wilder Seas, your first book, but I have previewed the writing. I had to because I really liked Lilith for its writing. It kind of felt to me very biblical, which I thought was absolutely perfect for what you're doing and the setting. And then, yes, on Wilder Seas, okay, I can see that it's written by the same person, but you've definitely got a kind of honing in on the biblical here.
Yeah.
I would like to just ask you about how you've written it here, and was being similar or the same as the Bible important?
Yes, I think sort of looking back, I wasn't really aware of it at the time, actually. It felt like a very natural way to write it when I was writing. But actually looking back, I did make some very unusual choices because the language is very mixed. It is very biblical, parts of it are very biblical, but parts are very modern. And there's this mixture of the biblical and this sort of very modern slang. And that's partly, because, when you read the book, you discover that really it's being narrated by Lilith from the modern day. And so that's why she has this very sort of ancient and modern speech. But also, I wanted the biblical language, especially in the older bits of the book, I wanted the biblical language to be there, partly because those bits are satirical, and I wanted to reference that sort of biblical way of speaking. At the beginning, for example, Adam is sort of going through his various inventions and creations, and he keeps saying that, and it will be good. That's a sort of a reference to the sort of biblical terminology. you've got the angels, and it was a very conscious decision of mine that I wanted the angels to speak in this kind of Miltonian way, because I wanted to sort of have that vibe for them. I wanted them to be this Miltonian era, that sort of, hellfire and damnation kind of idea. And so their language is very much mined from Milton. I sort of went through Paradise Lost and picked out those words that sort of really communicate that feeling. And, as I say, when I started writing it, Lilith's voice just came out like that. I didn't actually give it much thought. It's just that how she spoke. I guess because in my head, I knew she was speaking from the modern day, but I knew she was speaking about things that happened 6,000 years ago. So it came out like that. And it is odd. And not everyone likes it. Some people really don't like it. And I think you thought, having mentioned on Wilder Seas there, when I wrote that, I was very much immersed in 17th century texts. It's set in the 16th century. It's about Francis Drake's circumnavigation. And that kind of sort of fed through to the language as well. I sort of found myself sort of thinking and speaking in that different syntax, the different sentence construction and those unusual words that instantly are not modern, that communicate in another time and place. So I do like to do that in my writing. I do like to sort of use words that transport you to whatever that other time and place is, to sort of communicate that you're not in the normal everyday, you're in a completely different place.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely acceptable that someone who's lived for 6,000 years is going to pick up various phrases and words from all over the place.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, actually, in all that, you've actually said everybody but the person who actually made me ask the question, which is fascinating, actually, because I think you've pronounced it as Samael. I was reading your book before then and seeing the biblical stuff. And then you've got him, he comes in, and I mean, his personality, it's amazing, because there's suddenly, I could just see this guy who was ready to go down the pub and get a drink. And then later on, when he comes back, he's very different in his speech, which makes sense. 6,000 years have passed, and you've got this guy who's basically very posh, sounds jolly hockey sticks, and like he might have stepped out of a D.H. Lawrence novel or something. Yeah. So I want to ask specifically about how you created him in terms of his language.
When I was sort of thinking about him, what was important to me was that he needed to be what Adam isn't. He needed to be a proper partner to Lilith. So that's really what was at the forefront of my mind. He needed to be very, very attractive because, of course, Lilith is immediately attracted to him when she meets him. And he's an angel, of course he's sublime, of course he's angelic looking, he's gorgeous. So those are sort of the main priorities. But again, like Lilith, he has survived, he's there at the end of the book. He plays a very important role at the end of the book. In fact, he's even older than Lilith because he has been around since the dawn of time. He is the oldest character in the book. And I wanted him to be funny. I wanted him to be likable, and he's a trickster, really. He is a sort of a mischief maker, but he's not cruel or mean, but he's naughty. And so I wanted that to come out in his language, and I wanted him to be sort of lighthearted and funny. But at the very bottom of it, he just adores Lilith, and it's his love for her really that sets the whole book in motion. You discover that this whole business is really about, it's come about because he loves her, but he properly loves her. He doesn't love her in the way that he wants to control her. He loves her. He wants the best for her, and that's why this whole situation has come into being. So yes, that's really all what I was thinking about when I was writing Samael. I wanted him to be, the man that Lilith deserved.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. There's things that I didn't see in there before. I mean, I know for me, I did question, what's he doing sometimes, which sounds like what you were trying to get us to do as readers, kind of thinking, well, he seems to be very happy going to the Underworld. That seems all right. But at the same time, is he? It's very strange to say this, but my favourite character in the book is an angel of death.
Yeah.
It's really good. Really, really fun. I want to ask about your use of, I'm going to put them together, Jezebel and your references to Salome, which is, it's simply just Lilith takes on the name Salome at a point in time. But that felt important.
Yes.
So, talking about your use of Jezebel, obviously in the context of what we use Jezebel to mean, and Salome.
Yeah. Well, when I was sort of deciding which sort of biblical stories would appear in the book, there's obviously a huge time frame, huge amount of things to choose from. I kind of, knew I wanted to write about Jezebel, but it wasn't really until I started really researching her that I discovered just how apt she is for this particular book. Because, of course, if you sort of mention Jezebel to most people today, they will say, oh, yes, she's a famous whore, famous slut in the Bible. She painted her face. She was a famous adulterer. And she was the evil queen of Israel. Actually, that's not what's going on at all. The reason that she is vilified so much in the Bible is that, and the reason she's called an adulterer and a whore, is because she worships other gods other than Yahweh. And specifically, what I did not know until I started the research for Jezebel is that one of the main gods that she worships is Asherah. In that part of the Bible, in the Book of Kings, which tells the story of Jezebel, Asherah is presented as a foreign god. Now, she wasn't a foreign god. She was very much a Hebrew goddess, but she's being presented as a foreign god because that's the intention of the people writing that book. It's about events that took place in about the 9th century BC, but it's being written 300 years later at a time in history when, as we've already discussed, the writers and the editors of the text that became the Bible were trying to make the point that there's only one God. And that's why that part of the Bible is absolutely obsessed with God getting angry that people are worshipping other gods, because that's the point that is being made by the writers of those texts. And so Jezebel is vilified because she worships Asherah. And, her prophets are prophets of Asherah who sit at Jezebel's table. That's how the Bible puts it. There's this big contest between Yahweh and Baal, who is originally a Canaanite god, to determine who should be the god of Israel. And that's sort of a turning point in history, really, because that's really a decision between should the Israelite religion be polytheist or monotheist. And, of course, what happens in the Bible is that Yahweh wins and it becomes very much a monotheistic religion. But Jezebel is not a whore. She doesn't do anything sluttish or whorish at all. She's very faithful to her husband. She merely worships another god. And that is sort of a real example of what happens in the Bible with the way the Bible treats women. She does nothing that her sort of nemesis Elijah does. But of course, Elijah is held up to be this righteous prophet and she's a dirty slut. Elijah murders hundreds and hundreds of Jezebel's prophets. So, it's just one of those real examples in the Bible of the difference between the way men and women are treated. Now, Salome is really a very brief reference that Lilith starts calling herself Salome because she can't call herself Lilith anymore because everyone knows who Lilith is. Salome in the Bible is the girl who presents St. Paul's head on a platter. It wasn't really intentional to kind of bring that story into the book. I wanted Lilith to have a name of the era, and I wanted it to be a naughty girl of the era because that's her sort of vibe. So that's really why she's called Salome. So I don't really go into the story of Salome much, but it is a fascinating side story in the Bible. It's a really interesting story, which probably, I suspect, lots of kind of sort of hidden meanings and hidden contexts that are not immediately obvious. But yeah, Salome is not sort of necessarily a sort of a reference to that story of St. Paul.
Interesting. No, I think I caught on it as well because I was wondering again if the prophet might be John the Baptist. And yet, well, this does move me on to asking about Jesus. Well, there's a lot of controversial content you've got in your book. I think we've made that clear if anyone hasn't read the book already. But let's say this. I think that your depiction of Jesus, while it's not by any means saying that Jesus was a bad man, you're saying he was a really good man. I'd say this is probably the most controversial part of your book. So yeah, I just want to ask you about the changes. I know you've used aspects of the Gnostic Gospels, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, particularly Mary. Can you just talk about changing Jesus and being bold?
This was this was the most difficult bit of the book to write. In fact, I wrote it several times and it was completely different every time.
I'm not surprised.
Very, very difficult to get right and to kind of communicate what I wanted to say without being needlessly offensive. What drew me, the reason I didn't feel able to ignore Jesus. I felt he had to be in there. And, my book is about that suppression of female divinity. It's about the prioritization of the male over the female and the sort of refusal to see male and female as equal. And I felt that that pattern was repeated in early Christianity, because what you see in early Christianity is this prophet comes along, as there have been many, many prophets before him, and he comes along with a message of equality, which is a wonderful message. But then what happens? In the early Christian era, you did have proper equality. You had female bishops, you had congregations where no one was in charge, where people spoke, very much like sort of modern Quakers. People spoke and led the service if they felt able to, whether they were male or female. You did have, in some early Christian communities, you absolutely did see women being treated as equals. But what happens in the 4th century AD is that all of these sects, there were very many different sects of Christianity. They weren't sort of unified. Many of them had very different beliefs. Some of them didn't even believe in the resurrection. They thought that was a metaphor for sort of finding new wisdom, a new way of living. But what happens in the 4th century AD is that all of these sects are declared heretical. And by huge coincidence, all of these sects that practice true equality with men and women are those that are declared heretical. And so again, you see this pattern emerging. You see, from a top-down approach, you see the male assertion of male superiority over women. And it's the tragedy, I think, of Christianity. It's the tragedy of all religions that keeps happening. And the Gnostic Gospels are fascinating, and I would really urge people to read them if they're interested. These are Gospels that were very much circulating in those early years of Christianity, but which became heretical around this time that the Christian authorities decided what was orthodox and what was heretical. And so they were buried in a desert in Egypt, and the only reason we have them is that they were discovered in 1945. They give a very different picture of early Christianity, and the person who they give the most different picture of is Mary Magdalene. And in these Gospels, you see Mary Magdalene very much as much higher status than, you'll see her in the Bible. Not only the most important disciple, but also someone that they go to for teaching, someone who has teaching herself. And so there are sort of possibilities that sort of originally you might have had a scenario where you have a male and a female partner spreading a message of true equality. Now, I'm not, we don't have the evidence to say that's what was going on with Jesus. That's one interpretation that I've made in my book. But there are examples of other prophets around that era who did that. So that's what's interesting. And again, that goes back to much more ancient ideas of the sacred marriage, the male and the female in partnership. And what you see in the Gnostic Gospels is Mary Magdalene being sidelined by the other disciples, in particular Peter, who is just blatantly misogynistic. He complains to Jesus that Mary speaks too much. He complains to Jesus that Mary shouldn't be there at all because she's a woman, that all the women should go. He complains to Jesus that women aren't worthy of life. So again, for me, you see this pattern. You've got two competing ideas. You've got the one idea, men and women as partners, versus the idea of hierarchy, man in control of woman. And you had a possibility where the former idea could have won. How different would that have been? But of course it didn't. But that's what that bit of the book is about. And there are sort of very feminist readings of theology which show Jesus very much as bringing a message. And in fact, you see this in the Gnostic Gospels as well, that Jesus is talking about bringing a message not just from the Father, but from the Mother. And there are early examples of Christians invoking the Mother and invoking the Mother in the Eucharist, which is fascinating to me. I have that in my book. So you have these two possibilities. And the one that we ended up with was not inevitable. How different would the world have been had the other model won, that model of true equality, of true partnership, and not the elimination of everything female, not the erasure of the mother to prioritise the father. It's a big tragedy, I think.
Oh, it is fascinating. And I mean, again, it makes me think of like a sort of editing stage or something. But I mean, what you're pointing out about Peter and his attitude in these Gnostic Gospels, it sounds like there's a possibility there that someone was writing in response to the Gospels that we do have, which is just a fascinating... I've just thinking of that. But I mean, it's fascinating to think of how these gospels might have all influenced each other.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, there's, St. Paul as well says some extremely misogynistic things in the Bible. And there are possibilities that those were sort of edited in later. We don't know. We don't know if those were originally his words or whether that's something that came about 200 or 300 years later when there was this very misogynistic attitude in the church. St. Paul, in the Bible says, I do not permit a woman to have authority over a man. She is to remain silent. And he's speaking in response to something that was happening in the early church at that time, that women were speaking in churches, that they did have authority. And he's condemning that.
Well, I would actually like to ask, we have talked about the afterlife, we've talked about various things that kind of make me want to ask you this question. What was your religious background and what do you believe now?
I have quite a sort of perhaps an unusual background. So I'm half Cypriot, so I was sort of baptized into the Greek Orthodox religion, but my immediate family is not very religious. But I do have these halves of my family where one half is very, very religious. And so I see my elderly relatives and I see the comfort that the beliefs they have give them. And in fact, especially the women, even though I have concerns about the way Christianity and religion treats women, I can see how much comfort it brings to the women, the elderly women in my family. And yet I have these questions. And I think that tension perhaps is what sparks my interest in religion. And I think that's what sort of drives my interest in it. I do have a lot of positive feelings about religion and the way it sort of functions for people in the real world. I have lots of positive feelings about that. There are many things about churches that I love: the smells, the emotion, the symbolism. But it's the words that I have trouble with because they don't make much sense to me. So I think that it sparks my interest in it. And I think not coming from a sort of a very sort of overtly religious background, I think encouraged me to question and to wonder what's really going on.
I thought I picked up on that you had a sort of Christian background. Yeah, because you include so much in it. It's just, it seemed something to know, I think.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in all. I'm interested in all religions. I'm fascinated in that very human need for religion or for an explanation of who we are, where we come from. It's a fundamental human need because it's expressed across every culture and in every history. It's obviously a very basic need for humans to think about these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helps a lot in life and things. So, what are you writing now, or are you still on that writing break?
It's taken me a long time to get over Lilith, actually. I feel like I need to exercise myself.
Understandable.
There is something I really, really want to get started on, and I've kind of done the bare bones of the research. I've sort of got myself a reading list, but I haven't started it yet. And I really am sort of feeling that need to start. I can't wait. That moment at the beginning of a project where you have an idea, you can sort of almost see it out before you and all the things that you want to find out. I think for me, writing a book is about finding out things that you're interested in or answering questions that you have, following a path of curiosity. So I can see that path. I know the thing that I'm really interested in, and I just can't wait to get started. But I've just got so much stuff to do that I get very into it when I'm writing. So everything else goes by the wayside. So I need to sort of, finish off doing all the things that I've been ignoring for several years.
Well, I won't pry too much, but is it in the realms of history, historical fiction, mythology, that sort of, or are we looking at something different completely?
No, it's historical. It's ancient world. In fact, there's three things I want to do.
Write them all.
Again, not sure which one I'm going to do, but there's three things that I'm really interested in. They're all in the ancient world. They're all historical / mythological. One of them / biblical. So yeah, I've just got to decide which way I'm going to go. But that's what fascinates. It's the ancient world that really fascinates me. A few hundred years doesn't do it for me. I want thousands of years. That's what I really, really like.
No, yeah, I'd say rather you than me. The idea of trying to construct a story and from something that we've got less research on would be very scary to me. But I'm absolutely so glad that you're here to do that. Nikki, thank you so much for coming today. And I know we've been talking for a while, but yeah, there's so much to talk about in your book, and it's been absolutely wonderful. I said you've blown my mind. It's definitely, this content is going to stay with me for a long time. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me.
I do hope you enjoyed this episode. Do join me next time. And if you have a moment to spare, please do leave a rating and or review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Podcast Addict. Thank you. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 106, was recorded on the 18th of April and published on the 23rd of September 2024. Music and production by Charlie Place.